Tom, thank you so much for having this conversation with me today about the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. Now, I'm just looking at your biography, and you've got nearly 40 years' experience of working in the environment sector. You're founder and chief executive of NatureSpace, which is responsible for district licensing of newts, which is obviously a big part of this conversation. Trustee of the National Trust for the last 6 years, a former trustee of the Heritage Lottery Fund, and you were there for 6 years, and a former executive director at Natural England, where you worked for 20 years. I think that gives you a great position of authority to be able to talk about this subject today.
You're making me feel very old, Estelle, but yes, you're guilty as charged to all those things.
Absolutely, absolutely. Brilliant. Well, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So, Tom, I just wanted to start by kind of reflecting on where's this come from for a moment. There was a statement that came out from Sein a little while ago, just a sort of headline statement saying, in short, the government has been late in submitting its own impact review, has ignored critical impact from the environmental sector, and has presented a bill that is fundamentally unsound. The lack of transparency and the failure to follow an objective, evidence-led democratic process, which includes incorporating expert advice, is reckless and raises serious concerns about the long-term consequences of these legislative changes. Have you got a response to that? I mean, the planning and infrastructure, well, how do you read it, and how, with Saeem coming out with that statement, what's your initial response to that?
Well, I thought that was a very good statement from Saeem, actually, and it's measured and well considered, as their statements usually are. I think it reflects widespread disappointment across the sector that this bill is being rushed through Parliament. So not only were most of the sector surprised by the anti-environmental rhetoric that the government chose to run with, which was built up over several weeks and months. Not only were we surprised by the working paper, which came out without any fanfare, without any proper structure, without any formal consultation process. So no white paper, no green paper, no stakeholder engagement, a rushed working paper, which suddenly became draft legislation when the bill came out, again very quickly. The bill itself being rushed through the first reading. It's now gone to a committee stage. It's got a remarkably short committee stage for a bill of such complexity. And all the while, people across the sector, across the environment sector, were hearing from government that there were going to be no amendments, no changes. They made their mind up on it, and this was getting pushed through. And so it really felt, as Sein said in their statement, that we were being ignored. And the great tragedy there is that the sector is not anti-growth. We're certainly not anti-government. You know, the 8 million members across all the environmental charities, I think, are actually fundamentally centre-left. We are naturally supporters of this government, and everyone can see that the country needs growth. So why would the government not seek to listen to some of its most important stakeholders with a wealth of experience across the sector? So I think, the bill's seemingly come out of nowhere. It's being rushed through. It's poorly drafted, in my opinion, and in many others' opinions. And I think the CIM statement captured that disappointment, really.
Yeah. I mean, it is really quite extraordinary, and I mean the whole thing. It feels like it's going to upend the planning system as it is at the moment. Nature is the kind of wedge issue here, and obviously we've heard Keir Starmer talking a lot about bats, newts, and jumping spiders and all sorts of stuff. Does it feel to you that number 10 is kind of running this process? Obviously, we've got, the Department for Environmental and Rural Affairs, where are they in all of this? The whole thing feels like it's kind of, it's number 10, but then the housing guys as well. So,
yeah.
And then rewriting environmental legislation within all of that. And it kind of feels like Natural England, DEFRA, everybody's also been caught on the hop with this.
Yeah, I think the great sadness is that it really turns the clock back on 20 years of environmental discussion and debate, and pretending that the environment, or bats and newts, are bringing blocking the environment and bringing the country to its economic knees, is nonsense. It's literally rhetoric. There is no evidence. In fact, my company NatureSpace runs one of the great crested newt licensing schemes, and we are one of the very few people that has very concrete evidence on this. And I can tell you, Estelle, that 95% of all planning applications have no impact on newts whatsoever, and newts have no impact on them. Of the remaining 5%, 4% have a very minor impact, and only 1% of developments have any kind of significant impact on newts, and therefore might have to do something about their newts. This rhetoric that house buildings being held up by newts is simply plain nonsense.
Yeah.
The other great sadness is that when you have that environment versus growth rhetoric, you invite an adversarial position across different parts of the sector. And actually, I work daily with lots of brilliant house builders who do care about the environment, who do care about green infrastructure, who do care about the impact they're having, and are quite prepared to meet their environmental obligations if it can be done quickly and seamlessly. What they don't want is to be held up for 3 years doing a survey and not finding any newts. That's a waste of everyone's time. But this economy versus the environment rhetoric is short-sighted and wrong.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, it has pitched house builders against the environment sector in doing so, and perhaps a distraction away from, what is actually happening. So, I mean, there are some alarming parts of the bill as proposed, and we are laying down, saying the environment sector are suggesting amendments at the moment, and I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail about what they are, because there's a hell of a long list of them now by the looks of it. But I think this idea of the Nature Recovery Fund, everything that Natural England have worked towards with biodiversity net gain, and looking at other mechanisms, and obviously we've got local nature recovery strategies now, which that's kind of delegated down to local authorities. But there's a lot of mechanisms. Obviously we've got the way that newts are dealt with now. There's already mechanisms for doing a lot of this stuff, isn't there, dealing with it? So, why upend the whole thing and pay into this pot that actually, it feels like, where's the control of that? I don't know. How is that money going to get spent?
Yeah, I think the part 3 of the planning and infrastructure bill is flawed, not in intent, because the idea, which is to move to a strategic approach and to enable development to happen alongside nature recovery and vice versa, that's a perfectly good intent. What's flawed is how the bill is executed and what it sets out. And along the way, we lose fundamental environmental principles: mitigation hierarchy, precautionary principle, polluter pays, all of these things which we have fought for and defended for 70 years are being tossed out the window. This is the single largest, most regressive piece of legislation that has been brought in my lifetime. And the reason those things are being thrown out the window, in my opinion, is because the bill conflates two things. It conflates the diffuse effects of widespread nutrients and pollutions and their impacts on special sites. It conflates those widespread diffuse effects with site-based loss of habitat and impact on species. Once you throw in species into the diffuse pollution pot, then you are losing all of that species protection. Once you move away from doing some kind of impact assessment to work out what impact the development is having because of where it is and how big it is and what it's doing, once you move away from that system, then you lose all of those principles. And so whilst a lot of the amendments that are coming in are trying to reinsert some of those principles into the functioning of a levy, I actually think it's a tricky thing to do. I would far rather you just kept species and diffuse pollution separate. I think having a nature restoration fund for and environmental delivery plans for diffuse pollution is probably a great idea. I think we should give it a go, definitely. But I think lobbing bats and newts into that, and all of our other protected species, by the way, including all of our plants and all of our birds, I think that's a complete disaster. I've got there are lots of significant problems. Another problem I have with the bill is, and I have my old friends and colleagues in Natural England in my mind as I say this, is the taskmaster and the paymaster. And the environmental delivery plans are going to be signed off by the Secretary of State for Housing. So there's your taskmaster. And the level of the levy is going to be set by the house builders. So there are your paymasters. So I wouldn't want to be Natural England trying to run some really great and ambitious nature recovery programs when my boss was the Minister for Housing and my paymaster was a developer. I think that's creating a very difficult situation. And we know from experience that landscape scale recovery is expensive and is often underfunded. And what happens in 10 years' time when the next but two chairman of Natural England is a house builder, and the country's in an even worse economic state, and the Nature Restoration Fund levy is cut from £1,000 a house to £10 a house. What do we do then? Because all the species legislation's gone. There's no assessment of what's happened in those intervening 10 years because there's no monitoring and reporting. I don't want to sound paranoid, but there's
every right to, I think, Tom. Every right to.
There's lots of parts of this bill that I think there is some light, and you've kind of inferred it a wee bit there, Estelle, in your question, which is the bill, however it ends up, the bill is giving Natural England powers, not obligations. And I hope Natural England will be allowed to, in an unfettered way, allowed to use their discretion as to when they deploy EDPs and the Nature Restoration Fund, because they don't have to do it for all species in all places. They could choose to apply it as a scalpel rather than as a bomb, and just say, look, we're going to write an EDP for this particular catchment or this particular area because we have a particular problem here where alternative mechanisms aren't working. And if Natural England wield those powers in that spirit, then I think there's a lot more hope for constructive dialogue.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that. I guess it's hard, isn't it? Because the government have proposed this win-win situation, so we get more homes, and this nature recovery plan, all of a sudden it's funded, but you get into the detail of it, obviously, as we have done there, and it just is a lose-lose situation as we see it at the moment. So can you see, and obviously with your background, a lot of this stuff, a lot of this rhetoric around bats and newts and whatever is wrapped up in process. And I think you kind of suggested that, the delays to developments going ahead and all of that stuff that we're all familiar with, bats holding things up or costing a fortune. Do you think there's something in the process that of kind of the legislation as it is that could just be altered a little bit to make it easier? Do we have to upend everything?
Yes, I certainly do, and I'm gonna try here, Estelle, and not bore you about district licensing for newts, which you mentioned. But of course, my company has been delivering district licensing for newts for 7 years now. We're regulated by Natural England. We're very robustly and fairly regulated by Natural England, and they play a key role as a regulator. But the system we provide, we do all the maps, which means that developers don't have to do surveys, but we do an appropriate assessment of impact. So we work out which developers are having an impact, and they pay fees into a strategic scheme accordingly. So a bit like the Nature Restoration Fund, but it's not a levy where everyone pays the same thing. It's a polluter pays. And that delivers a landscape scale strategy, and we create 4 ponds for every one that's lost, and the money goes out into the NGO sector and then finds its way to farmers and landowners. So lots of people are invested in the scheme, and it's not always cheap, the district licensing scheme, but as I say, developers actually are quite prepared to meet their environmental obligations with their checkbook if they need to, as long as they've got a clear, streamlined, quick process. And how it works for district licensing is that they come to us and we give them a report within 10 working days, and they submit that report with their planning permission, and with their planning application, and then when they get planning permission, they're licensed immediately by the local authority, who are the people that are holding the license. So that's a great example, I think, of integrating the species protection and the planning system together. There are absolutely no delays. There's no need for developers to do surveys, and they are covered under the license. And if they come across a newt when they start their development works, they're covered to move it to one side out of harm's way. Yeah. That is a strategic scheme, exactly what the government's asking for, which delivers a win-win. It's not only a win for the newts and a win for developers, it's a win for planning authorities, who have a reduced burden because all of the newt work is taken out of their hands. The scheme supports their administration. And by the way, it also continues to employ the skilled environmental consultancy sector, which is where we started this conversation with Sein rightly pointing out that the PIB is not just about speeding up house building, it has other knock-on effects.
Yeah, no, couldn't agree more. And the government might well turn around to us, the environment sector, and say, well, look, the environment's in a poor state. That's probably your fault. You haven't stepped up to that. Everything that you've done hasn't worked. We're proposing something here which is truly kind of big scale. There's an opportunity to restore nature, but at the same time, it doesn't feel like the levers are in there, from what they're suggesting. And that's, you talked about that already. If kind of from your position now, what would you be saying? What was your plea to government?
In terms of the planning and infrastructure bill, I think the intent is fine, guys, but let's try it with pollutants and nutrient neutrality. Let's see how the scheme works, collect some data, learn from how it works. There are lots of other things you can do for dealing with protected species, but the key message is bats are not your enemy. There are 101 reasons why houses are not getting built in this country, and bats are not in that top 100. But by all means, let's see if we can streamline and improve regulation. I mean, I would say, Estelle, that environmental regulation and the accusation of gold plating has undergone 4 different reviews under successive governments over the last 20 years. And each one of those evidence-based reviews has concluded that the environmental legislation is entirely fit for purpose and appropriate. Yeah. This is the first government that has not done a review and has just leapt into a solution. So, my advice on PIB would be work with the environment sector. Let's get something good out of it, but don't push through, the whole harebrained scheme. Yeah. My advice, if you'd allow me 30 seconds to give my general advice to government, I think they're making a mistake. I think the anti-environmental stuff is making a mistake. I just wish that more people in Treasury and Number 10 would go back and reread the Dasgupta review, a report commissioned by Treasury not that long ago, which sets out the fundamentals of how a thriving economy depends on a thriving natural environment and not the other way around. I think we should reassess how we measure the health of the country. It's not just about GDP and economy. I think we should be starting to measure other things, and getting away from our obsession with growth. And I think it feels like the pendulum has swung away from understanding of the climate and biodiversity threats. And as I sit here at the end of my career as an old man, I think back 40 years to the start of my career in the 80s, and we were appalled in the 80s at the loss of biodiversity that had happened in the preceding 30 years since the Second War. And now we are appalled at the loss of biodiversity that's happened since the 1980s. And I think that that fundamental shift in baselines, where we don't, it's hard to explain just how impoverished our countryside is.
Yeah.
On top of droughts and 40-degree summers, there's an awful lot to really worry about, and maybe building a few more houses shouldn't be the top of our worry list.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And like you're saying, there's plenty other blockers. It's not just wildlife, is it, really? But I mean, ultimately, do you think that nature and development can go hand in hand?
Oh yeah, absolutely, I do. And I think the sector's been saying that for a long time now. And I think, the district licensing for newts is a great example. But there's no shortage of land in this country to build on. 75–80% of our land is farmed, and 20% of that farmland delivers just 3% of the calorific output. There are lots of things to talk about in terms of land use frameworks and food securities. It's not shortage of land that's getting in the way. It's when you decide to build a very, very straight and fast railway line straight through the middle of an ancient woodland that's been there for 500 years, and then you act surprised that actually there's some very rare species of bats that you're killing. It's not the bats' fault, it's not the woodland's fault, it's the fact that there wasn't the appropriate level of mitigation and avoidance being built into the scheme. And I see the vast majority of housing development proposals that come through us are well considered, well thought out. They do avoid, they do mitigate. 95% of them have no impact on the environment. There's absolutely no reason why we can't build 1 million houses and have nature recovery.
Tom, that's fantastic. Thank you for talking to me today. I think that's loud and clear. That message is loud and clear. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Estelle.